The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like a shroud of history itself. In the pre-dawn darkness, a single pair of boots echoed across the cobblestones, breaking the silence that had settled over the royal grounds. Sergeant Major William Hayes paused at the entrance to the guardhouse, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp April air. In his weathered hands, he held a sealed envelope bearing the royal coat of arms, orders that would set in motion the most significant military ceremony of his 30-year career. Inside that envelope lay the detailed plans for what would become one of the most watched and precisely executed military operations in modern British history. It wasn't a battle plan or a strategic defense initiative. It was something far more profound and personal, the final farewell to a man who had served his country for over 7 decades, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. What the world would witness in just 9 days would appear effortless, a seamless display of British military precision and pageantry. But behind the scenes, hundreds of servicemen and women would dedicate every waking moment to ensuring that not a single step, salute, or note would be out of place. This is the untold story of those 9 days, a story of dedication, honor, and the weight of tradition resting on the shoulders of ordinary people called to perform an extraordinary duty. As Hayes broke the royal seal and began to read, he had no idea that the coming week would test everything he believed about leadership, loyalty, and the true meaning of service. The Duke's final journey would become theirs as well, transforming each participant in ways they never expected and creating bonds that would last far beyond the final trumpet note. The notification came at 6:47 a.m. on a Friday morning that would forever divide the lives of Britain's military personnel into before and after. Sergeant Major William Hayes was reviewing duty rosters in his office at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst when his secure phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but carried an undercurrent of gravity that made Hayes straighten in his chair. Operation Fourth Bridge is now in effect, the voice said simply. You have been selected as the lead coordinator for military ceremonial duties. Report to Windsor Castle at 1,400 hours for immediate briefing. Hayes had spent his entire adult life in the military, from his teenage years as a fresh-faced recruit to his current position overseeing ceremonial training. He had participated in state funerals, royal weddings, and countless parades. But this was different. Operation Fourth Bridge was the code name that had existed for decades, waiting in classified files for the day when Prince Philip would need his final military send-off. As Hayes drove through the gates of Windsor Castle that afternoon, he noticed the flags already flying at half-mast. The ancient fortress seemed to emanate a sense of solemn purpose, its stone walls holding the weight of nearly 1,000 years of royal history. Security was heightened, with additional checkpoints and serious face guards who examined his credentials with unusual scrutiny. The briefing room was located in a part of the castle Hayes had never seen before, deep within the administrative quarters where the business of monarchy was conducted away from public view. When he entered, he found himself among 23 other military personnel, each representing different branches and units. Their faces reflected his own mixture of honor and apprehension at being chosen for such a significant responsibility. Colonel Margaret Thornton, a woman Hayes knew by reputation as one of the most exacting officers in the British military, stood at the front of the room beside a covered easel. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform bore the ribbons of someone who had served with distinction across multiple deployments. She waited until the last officer had taken their seat before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 9 days to organize and execute what may be the most scrutinized military ceremony in recent memory, she began, her voice carrying easily to the back of the room. The Duke of Edinburgh was a man who dedicated his life to service, and he specifically requested that his funeral reflect his military heritage rather than traditional royal pageantry. She pulled away the cover from the easel, revealing a detailed map of Windsor Castle and its grounds. Colored arrows and number positions marked various stations and routes. The service will take place at St. George's Chapel, but our responsibilities extend far beyond that single location. We must coordinate the arrival and placement of representatives from the Royal Navy, Army, and Royal Air Force. We must ensure the proper handling of the Duke's personal standard and his military honors. And we must do all of this while the world watches. Captain James Morrison, a young officer from the Household Cavalry, raised his hand. Ma'am, what are the specific restrictions we're working under? I understand this won't be a full state funeral. Colonel Thornton nodded. Correct. Due to current circumstances and the Duke's own wishes, we're limited to 30 attendees. This means every movement, every position, every detail must be perfect because there will be no crowds to hide mistakes or opportunities for corrections. The ceremony will be intimate, but no less precise. Hayes studied the faces around him. These were career military personnel, people who had trained their entire lives for moments exactly like this. Yet he could see the same concern in their eyes that he felt in his own chest. The margin for error was essentially zero, and the pressure would be unlike anything they had experienced. Over the next 3 hours, they were walked through every aspect of the ceremony. The Duke's coffin would be transported from the state entrance to St. George's Chapel on a specially modified Land Rover that he had helped design himself. The journey was short, only about 250 yards, but those yards would need to be measured, timed, and rehearsed until every step was as natural as breathing. The bearer party would consist of Royal Marines, reflecting the Duke's long association with that service. They would need to practice not just the lifting and carrying of the coffin, but the precise timing required to coordinate with the moving vehicle and the needs of the television cameras that would broadcast the ceremony to millions. The band of the Grenadier Guards would provide musical accompaniment, but their positioning and selection of pieces required careful consideration. Every note would be heard clearly in the chapel's acoustics, and the timing had to accommodate both the solemnity of the occasion and the practical requirements of the procession. Major Sarah Campbell, an expert in ceremonial protocol, took over the briefing to discuss the more technical aspects. The Duke's personal standard will be carried by a representative from each service branch, she explained, pointing to specific positions on the map. These individuals will be selected based on their ceremonial experience and their personal connection to units the Duke patronized. She continued, his naval cap and sword will be placed on the altar by his private secretary, but our personnel must ensure these items are properly prepared and positioned beforehand. The chapel itself has specific requirements for where military personnel can stand, and we must coordinate with the College of Heralds to ensure we don't interfere with their responsibilities. As the briefing continued, Hayes found himself taking extensive notes, but also observing the people around him. Lieutenant Colonel David Parr from the Welsh Guards was known for his attention to detail in drill movements. Warrant Officer First Class Michelle Roberts from the Royal Navy had overseen ceremonial duties at Britannia Royal Naval College for 8 years. Each person in the room brought specific expertise that would be essential in the coming week. The magnitude of the task began to settle over the group as Colonel Thornton outlined the schedule for the next 9 days. Tomorrow, Saturday, we begin with site surveys and initial measurements. Sunday will be our first full rehearsal with stand-ins. Monday through Wednesday will involve rehearsals with actual equipment and participants. Thursday will be our dress rehearsal, exactly as it will appear on Saturday. She paused, looking around the room. Friday will be a rest day for most personnel, with only essential preparation activities. The funeral is scheduled for Saturday at 3 p.m., but our people will be in position beginning at 11 a.m. Captain Morrison asked, "What about contingencies? Weather, unexpected circumstances?" "We plan for everything," Major Campbell answered. "Rain, wind, technical difficulties with equipment, medical emergencies among participants. Every scenario has been considered, and we'll review backup plans daily." As the formal briefing concluded, Hayes noticed that several officers remained behind to discuss specific concerns with Colonel Thornton. The weight of responsibility was evident in their hushed conversations and serious expressions. This wasn't just another ceremony. It was the final tribute to a man who had spent decades supporting the very military organization that would now honor him. Walking back to his car as the afternoon sun began to set over Windsor Castle, Hayes reflected on the unique nature of their assignment. Prince Philip had been colonel-in-chief of dozens of military units, patron of countless military charities, and a constant presence at ceremonial events for over 70 years. The service members participating in his funeral had likely encountered him at some point in their careers, whether directly or through the organizations he supported. That evening, Hayes called his wife to explain that he would be essentially living at Windsor Castle for the next week. She understood, as military spouses do, but he could hear the pride in her voice when he described the honor of being selected for such an important duty. "Will you be nervous?" she asked. Hayes considered the question carefully. "Not nervous exactly," he finally answered, "but aware that we're handling something precious. This man dedicated his life to service, and now it's our turn to serve him." As he prepared for bed that night, Hayes reviewed the detailed schedule one more time. Tomorrow would begin the most intensive week of preparation any of them had ever undertaken. The world would be watching, history would be recording, and 24 military professionals would need to perform flawlessly under conditions they had never experienced. But more than that, they would be participating in something deeply meaningful. The final salute to a man who had embodied the values they all swore to uphold. The technical precision would matter, but the spirit behind their actions would matter even more. In military tradition, the greatest honor that could be bestowed was to serve as a guardian for a fallen comrade. For the next 9 days, that's exactly what they would be. Guardians ensuring that Prince Philip's final journey would be conducted with the dignity, respect, and military precision that had characterized his entire life of service. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost still clinging to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle when the military team assembled for their first day of preparation. Hayes arrived at 6:30 a.m. to find that several others had beaten him there, including Warrant Officer Roberts, who was already pacing the route from the state entrance to St. George's Chapel with a measuring wheel and stopwatch. "Morning, Sergeant Major," she called out. "I wanted to get the exact distances before we start timing the procession. The ground is slightly uneven in 3 places, and that will affect the pace." Hayes nodded approvingly. This attention to detail was exactly what would be needed to pull off a flawless ceremony. Over the next hour, the full team assembled, and they began the methodical process of surveying every inch of the route, every position where personnel would stand, and every angle that would be visible to cameras. Colonel Thornton arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, carrying a large folder of photographs and diagrams. "Before we begin physical rehearsals," she announced, "we need to understand exactly what we're recreating." The Duke was very specific about certain elements he wanted included, and we have historical precedents to guide us. She spread out photographs from previous royal funerals and ceremonial events. "Notice the positioning of the bearer party here," she said, pointing to a black and white photograph from a ceremony in the 1960s. The Duke himself helped establish these protocols. He believed military ceremony should be functional, not just decorative. Major Campbell had spent the early morning coordinating with the chapel authorities and the television production team. "We have 12 camera positions to work around," she reported, "but they've been positioned to capture the ceremony without interfering with our movements. The main challenge will be the acoustic requirements for the band." The band of the Grenadier Guards had already set up their equipment and were conducting sound tests. The chapel's ancient architecture created unique acoustic properties that required careful consideration of where each instrument would be positioned. Bandmaster Chief Warrant Officer Timothy Collins was working with the chapel's organist to ensure that the military music would complement rather than compete with the organ. The Duke specifically requested pieces that reflected his naval service, Collins explained to Hayes. "But we also need to maintain the solemnity appropriate for the location and occasion. It's a delicate balance." The bearer party presented perhaps the greatest technical challenge. 8 Royal Marines have been selected for this honor, each chosen not only for their ceremonial experience, but also for their physical compatibility in terms of height and pace. The Duke had been a tall man, and the coffin, along with its ceremonial elements, would be considerably heavy. Corporal Michael Thompson, the senior member of the bearer party, had been working with his team since early morning to practice their movements without any equipment. "We need to be synchronized to the point where we move as one person," he explained to Hayes. "Any variation in step or timing will be immediately visible, especially with the camera coverage we'll have." The modified Land Rover that would transport the coffin had arrived the previous evening and was now being inspected by a team of mechanics and ceremonial specialists. Prince Philip had been involved in its design, specifying modifications that would make it suitable for royal ceremonial use while maintaining its military character. The vehicle needed to maintain a precise speed during the procession, and its engine sound had to be considered in relation to the musical accompaniment. Lieutenant Sarah Williams from the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers was overseeing the vehicle preparation. "The Duke wanted something that reflected his practical nature," she explained. "This isn't an ornate hearse. It's a working military vehicle adapted for ceremonial use. But that means we need to ensure every mechanical aspect functions perfectly." As the morning progressed, the team began their first walkthrough of the ceremony. Without the actual coffin or any of the ceremonial elements, they focused purely on positioning and timing. Hayes was struck by how different the route felt when walked at the slow, measured pace required for a funeral procession compared to normal movement through the castle grounds. "Remember," Colonel Thornton called out as they practiced, "every step will be visible to millions of people. Your posture, your expression, your precise positioning, all of it matters. But more than that, you're representing not just yourselves, but the entire British military." The first challenge became apparent immediately. The route included a slight incline that wasn't noticeable during normal walking, but became significant when maintaining the slow, ceremonial pace. The bearer party would need to adjust their technique to accommodate this change in terrain while appearing completely natural. Warrant Officer Roberts was timing everything with military precision. "From the state entrance to the chapel steps, we're looking at exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds at the proper pace," she reported. "But that timing has to account for the pause at the chapel entrance while the coffin is transferred from the vehicle to the bearer party." Captain Morrison from the Household Cavalry was working on the coordination between mounted and dismounted personnel. Although the ceremony would be smaller in scale than a full state funeral, there would still be representatives from various military units who needed to be positioned precisely. "The challenge is creating visual balance," he explained to Hayes. "With fewer people, each individual position becomes more critical. We can't hide any mistakes in a crowd." The afternoon was dedicated to working with the actual equipment that would be used in the ceremony. The Duke's personal standard, his naval cap, and his ceremonial sword were brought out under careful supervision. These weren't replicas, they were the actual items that would be used in the funeral, and handling them properly was both a technical and emotional responsibility. Flight Lieutenant Amanda Foster from the Royal Air Force had been selected to carry the Duke's RAF standard. As she practiced her movements with the actual flag, Hayes noticed the care and reverence with which she handled it. This standard flew over Buckingham Palace whenever the Duke was in residence in his capacity as Marshal of the Royal Air Force, she said quietly. "It represents decades of service and thousands of people who served under his patronage. The weight and balance of the ceremonial items required practice to handle gracefully. The standards needed to be held at precisely the right angle, moved with smooth, controlled motions, and positioned exactly where they would be most visible to both the congregation and the cameras." As the day wore on, the complexity of coordinating all these elements became clear. Every person had to know not only their own role, but how their actions affected everyone else. The musicians' timing affected the bearer party's pace. The bearer party's positioning affected the camera angles. The vehicle speed affected the overall rhythm of the ceremony. Major Campbell gathered everyone together late in the afternoon to review the day's progress. "We've identified the key challenge points," she announced. "The terrain variation, the acoustic requirements, the coordination between the vehicle and the bearer party, and the positioning of the standards. Tomorrow we'll begin integrated rehearsals with all elements." Hayes noticed that despite the intensive day of practice, morale among the team was high. These were professional military personnel, and they responded well to clear objectives and the opportunity to perfect their skills. But there was something more, a sense that they were participating in something historically significant. That evening, as the team dispersed to their quarters, Hayes found himself walking the route one more time alone. In the quiet of the evening, with only the sound of his own footsteps on the ancient stones, he tried to imagine what it would feel like on the actual day. The weight of responsibility, the eyes of the world watching, the knowledge that they were conducting the final military tribute to a man who had dedicated his life to service. The castle grounds at night had a different character than during the busy preparation of the day. The buildings seemed to hold the weight of centuries of history, and Hayes felt the connection between their current mission and the long tradition of military service that had been honored within these walls for generations. His phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Thornton. "Excellent work today. Tomorrow we add the pressure of real-time coordination. Get rest. We'll need everyone at their best." As Hayes headed to his temporary quarters, he reflected on the unique nature of their assignment. Most military operations were about projecting strength, defending territory, or accomplishing strategic objectives. This operation was different. It was about projecting respect, honoring tradition, and accomplishing something that couldn't be measured in tactical terms, but mattered just as much. The Duke had spent over 7 decades supporting the military through his various roles and patronages. Now it was their turn to support him, to ensure that his final journey would be conducted with the precision, dignity, and military bearing that he had exemplified throughout his life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began to integrate all the separate elements they had practiced individually. The real test would come when everything had to work together seamlessly, when a margin for error would become even smaller, and when the ceremony would begin to take on the character it would have on the actual day. But tonight, Hayes felt confident that they had the right people for the task. The dedication and professionalism he had observed throughout the day convinced him that when the moment came, the British military would honor Prince Philip exactly as he deserved, with precision, respect, and the quiet pride that had characterized his own approach to service. Sunday morning brought the first full dress rehearsal, and, with it, the nervous energy that comes when individual practice sessions must transform into a coordinated performance. Hayes arrived to find the castle grounds already bustling with activity. The bearer party was conducting final equipment checks on the practice coffin, while the band was setting up their instruments with the precision of a military operation. Colonel Thornton had called the rehearsal for 9 a.m., exactly the same time of day when the actual ceremony would begin its final preparations. "We need to understand how everything feels at the actual time," she had explained. "Light conditions, acoustics, even the way people move differently at different times of day, all of it matters." The practice coffin was an exact replica in terms of weight and dimensions, covered with a simple cloth rather than the ceremonial elements that would adorn the actual coffin. Corporal Thompson and his bearer party approached it with the same reverence they would show on the actual day. Their weeks of preparation were evident in the way they moved together, 8 individuals functioning as a single unit. "Remember," Thompson called out to his team, "the Duke served with the Royal Navy for active duty during the war. He understood what it meant to depend on your shipmates. We're his shipmates now, and he's depending on us to get this right." The first challenge came immediately. The practice coffin felt different than their training weights, and the bearer party had to adjust their technique slightly. It was exactly the kind of detail that could only be discovered through full rehearsal with actual equipment. Warrant Officer Roberts was positioned at various points along the route with her stopwatch, calling out timing updates. 4 minutes, 20 seconds to the chapel steps," she announced. "We're 10 seconds fast. The vehicle needs to slow slightly, or the bearer party needs to extend their pace." This was the delicate balance they had been working toward all week. The procession had to maintain the dignity appropriate for the occasion while staying precisely on schedule for the television broadcast. Too fast, and it would appear rushed. Too slow, and it would disrupt the careful timing of the service itself. Lieutenant Williams had the Land Rover running at exactly the right engine temperature and speed. The vehicle's modified design meant that its handling was slightly different from a standard military vehicle, and she had spent hours practicing the precise acceleration and deceleration needed to maintain the proper pace throughout the route. The Duke was involved in testing the original modifications, she explained to Hayes during a brief pause in the rehearsal. He wanted to ensure it could handle ceremonial duties while maintaining its military character. It's actually quite fitting that his final journey will be on something he helped create. The band of the Grenadier Guard was discovering the unique challenges of performing in the open air of the castle grounds versus their usual indoor venues. Chief Warrant Officer Collins had positioned his musicians to account for wind direction and the acoustic properties of the ancient stone buildings surrounding them. The Duke specifically requested the last post, which is traditional for military funerals, Collins explained. But the timing has to be perfect. Too early, and it disrupts the flow of the procession. Too late, and it loses its impact. As the morning progressed, they ran through the ceremony 3 complete times, with Colonel Thornton stopping to address specific issues after each run. The coordination between all the moving parts was improving, but each rehearsal revealed new details that needed attention. The positioning of the military standards proved particularly challenging. Flight Lieutenant Foster, carrying the RAF standard, discovered that the wind patterns around the castle created unexpected challenges for maintaining the proper angle and preventing the flag from wrapping around its pole. It's not just about physical technique, she explained during a break. These standards represent real units with real history. The Duke was colonel-in-chief of these organizations for decades. Carrying their colors at his funeral isn't just ceremonial, it's deeply personal. Major Campbell was working with representatives from each service branch to ensure that their positioning reflected both protocol requirements and the visual balance needed for the television coverage. With a smaller ceremony than usual, each person's position became more critical to the overall appearance. The Duke valued substance over style, she reminded everyone. But he also understood that ceremony serves a purpose. It's how we show respect publicly, how we demonstrate that some things matter enough to do perfectly. By afternoon, they were ready for the most challenging part of the rehearsal, the actual transfer of the coffin from the Land Rover to the bearer party at the chapel entrance. This moment would be the most technically demanding and the most visible to the cameras positioned around the chapel. The 8 Royal Marines had practiced this transfer dozens of times with their training equipment, but doing it with the practice coffin while coordinating with the vehicle, the band, and the positioning of other personnel added layers of complexity they hadn't experienced before. Smooth, controlled movement, Corporal Thompson reminded his team. Remember, we're not just moving a coffin. We're accepting responsibility for the Duke's final journey. Everything we do from this point forward is about honoring that responsibility. The first attempt was technically correct, but lacked the fluid grace they were striving for. The second was better, with improved coordination between the vehicle crew and the bearer party. By the third attempt, they had achieved the seamless transition that would be needed on the actual day. Hayes watched this process with growing admiration for the professionalism of everyone involved. These were people who had volunteered for the most demanding aspects of military service, and they were applying that same commitment to ensuring Prince Philip received the perfect send-off he deserved. As the afternoon rehearsal concluded, Colonel Thornton gathered everyone for a comprehensive review. "We've made excellent progress," she announced. "The timing is within acceptable parameters, the coordination is improving steadily, and the overall appearance is developing the character we need." She paused to look around at the assembled personnel. "But I want to remind everyone why we're here. Prince Philip dedicated 7 decades to supporting the military. He understood that our job isn't just about the technical aspects of what we do. It's about the values we represent and the standards we maintain. Captain Morrison raised a concern that had been bothering several of the participants. "Ma'am, with the limited attendance due to current restrictions, there will be less margin for error than usual. Every small mistake will be more visible." "That's exactly right," Colonel Thornton replied. "And that's why we're rehearsing so thoroughly. But remember, the Duke himself faced situations where there was no margin for error. He served on active duty during wartime, when mistakes had life and death consequences. We can handle the pressure of performing perfectly for his funeral." The evening was dedicated to individual skill refinement. Each service branch worked separately on their specific responsibilities, while Hayes and the senior staff reviewed logistics and contingency plans. The weather forecast was favorable, but they had to be prepared for any possibility. Warrant Officer Roberts approached Hayes as he was reviewing the timing charts one more time. "Sergeant Major, I've been thinking about the significance of what we're doing here. The Duke could have requested a simple service with minimal ceremony, but he chose to have military honors. He wanted us to be part of his final tribute." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "It's an honor, but it's also a responsibility. We represent every service member who ever served under his patronage, everyone who benefited from his support and advocacy." That evening, as the team settled in for what would be their last night before the intensive final rehearsals began, Hayes found himself reflecting on the unique bond that was forming among the participants. They came from different service branches, different specialties, and different backgrounds, but they were united by their commitment to honoring Prince Philip's legacy. The Duke had spent his life bringing together different military organizations, supporting joint operations, and advocating for cooperation between services. In a way, their diverse team was a perfect representation of his approach to military leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Park from the Welsh Guards stopped by Hayes's temporary office before heading to his quarters. "Sergeant Major, I wanted to mention something I noticed today. During the rehearsals, especially when we were handling the standards and practicing with the practice coffin, I could see that everyone was thinking about more than just their technical responsibilities." "What do you mean?" Hayes asked. "I mean, they were thinking about the Duke himself, about what he meant to their units and to the military as a whole. That kind of personal connection is what transforms a technically correct ceremony into something truly meaningful." Hayes understood exactly what Park meant. Over the past few days, he had heard countless stories from team members about their connections to Prince Philip's legacy. Some had served in units he had patronized. Others had participated in events where he was present. A few had even met him personally. But more than personal connections, there was a shared understanding of what Prince Philip represented, the idea that service to country and commitment to duty were values worth dedicating your life to. The precision they were striving for in the ceremony wasn't just about avoiding mistakes. It was about demonstrating that these values still mattered, that they were still worth doing perfectly. As Hayes prepared for bed, he reviewed the schedule for the coming week. 3 more days of intensive rehearsals, each one building toward the dress rehearsal on Thursday. Then Friday would be a rest day, allowing everyone to prepare mentally and physically for Saturday's ceremony. The technical aspects were coming together well, but Hayes knew that the real test would come when they had to perform under the pressure and emotion of the actual day. When the world was watching, when the royal family was present, when the weight of history and tradition rested on their shoulders. But looking back on the past 3 days, watching the dedication and professionalism of everyone involved, Hayes felt confident that they would rise to the occasion. Prince Philip had chosen well when he requested military honors for his funeral. The men and women preparing to honor him represented the best of what he had supported throughout his life: excellence, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right, regardless of the cost or difficulty involved. Thursday morning arrived with an unexpected development that would test every contingency plan the team had prepared. As Hayes arrived at Windsor Castle at his usual early hour, he was met by Colonel Thornton, who wore the expression of someone who had been dealing with complications since before dawn. "We have a situation," she said without preamble. "Weather reports are calling for possible rain on Saturday, and one of our bearer party members has developed flu symptoms. We need to adapt our final rehearsal to address both possibilities. Hayes felt his stomach tighten. After days of perfect preparation, the reality of uncontrollable variables was asserting itself at the worst possible moment. But this was exactly why they had planned so thoroughly, to be ready for anything that might challenge their ability to honor Prince Philip appropriately. The flu situation was handled quickly, but required careful consideration. Marine Corporal James Fletcher, who had been training with the Bear Party all week, would need to be replaced. His backup, Corporal David Park, had been training alongside the primary team, but would need intensive practice to integrate seamlessly with the group dynamics that had been developing. The good news, Corporal Thompson explained to Hayes, is that Park has been watching every rehearsal and practicing the movements. The challenge is that the Bear Party functions as a unit. We've developed an almost instinctive sense of each other's movements and timing. The morning was spent integrating Park into the Bear Party while simultaneously running weather contingency drills. The castle grounds were sprayed with water to simulate rain conditions, and the team practiced maintaining their precise movements and timing on whetstones that would be significantly more slippery than the dry conditions they had been rehearsing in. Rain changes everything, Warrant Officer Roberts observed as she timed their movements on the wet surfaces. Pace has to be slightly slower for safety, but we can't let it appear cautious or uncertain. The Duke served through all kinds of weather. He would expect us to adapt and maintain our standards regardless of conditions. The modified Land Rover presented new challenges in wet conditions. Lieutenant Williams had to adjust her driving technique to account for the reduced traction on the ancient cobblestones while maintaining the precise speed and smooth acceleration that had taken days to perfect. The Duke was known for his practical approach to problems, she explained as she practiced the route for the 10th time that morning. He would understand that we need to prioritize safety while maintaining dignity. But he would also expect us to make the adjustments look natural and professional. The band of the Grenadier Guards faced their own weather-related challenges. Musical instruments, particularly brass instruments, performed differently in humid conditions, and the acoustic properties of the outdoor space would change if sound had to compete with wind or rain. Chief Warrant Officer Collins was working with his musicians to adjust their positioning and technique. We've prepared alternative arrangements that account for weather conditions, he explained. The music must maintain its impact regardless of what nature throws at us. By midday, the integrated rehearsal was ready to begin. This would be the final complete run-through before the actual ceremony, performed exactly as it would appear on Saturday, including full ceremonial dress and all the actual equipment that would be used. The team assembled at their starting positions with a seriousness that reflected the significance of the moment. Over the past week, they had transformed from a group of individually skilled military personnel into a coordinated unit capable of performing one of the most challenging ceremonial duties in British military tradition. Hayes positioned himself at the observation point, where he would coordinate communications during the actual ceremony. From there, he could see the entire route and communicate with key personnel at critical moments if any adjustments were needed. "Remember," Colonel Thornton announced over the communication system, "this is not just a rehearsal anymore. This is our final opportunity to honor Prince Philip before we do it for real. Approach it with the respect and precision he deserves." As the ceremony began, Hayes was struck by the transformation that had occurred over the week. The same people who had been learning their positions and timing just days before now moved with the confidence and precision of a unit that had been working together for years. The Bear Party's integration of Corporal Park was flawless. The adjustment period they had worried about proved unnecessary. Park had been so focused on learning every detail that he fit into the team's rhythm immediately. The 8 Marines moved as one person, their timing and coordination indistinguishable from what they had achieved with the original lineup. The procession route, which had seemed so challenging early in the week, now felt natural. Every slight change in terrain, every positioning requirement, every timing mark had been practiced until it was second nature. The participants moved through the ceremony with the quiet confidence that comes from thorough preparation. The Land Rover performed perfectly, its modified engine maintaining the exact pace required while producing the dignified sound that Prince Philip had envisioned when he helped design the modifications. Lieutenant Williams's driving was so smooth that the vehicle appeared to glide along the route, providing a stable platform for the ceremonial elements it carried. The musical accompaniment provided by the Grenadier Guards enhanced rather than competed with the natural sounds of the ceremony. The timing and positioning that Collins had worked so hard to perfect created a soundscape that felt both solemn and uplifting, exactly the balance needed for a military funeral that celebrated a life of service rather than simply mourning its end. Flight Lieutenant Foster's handling of the RAF standard demonstrated the weeks of practice that had gone into every detail. The flag moved with controlled grace, never wrapping around its pole despite the outdoor conditions, and positioned exactly where it would be most visible to both the assembled congregation and the television audience. As the procession reached St. George's Chapel and the bearer party executed the transfer from the Land Rover, Hayes felt a sense of pride in what the team had accomplished. The movement was so smooth and professional that it appeared effortless, but Hayes knew the hours of practice that had gone into making it look natural. The positioning of military personnel around the chapel during the service itself was equally impressive. Each person knew exactly where to stand, when to move, and how their actions affected the overall ceremony. The choreography was complex, but it had been practiced until it felt instinctive. Colonel Thornton's voice came through the communication system as the rehearsal concluded. "Outstanding work, everyone." That was exactly what Prince Philip would have expected from the British military. Professional, dignified, and perfectly executed. The afternoon was spent on final equipment checks and addressing the few minor details that had been identified during the morning's rehearsal. Each piece of equipment was inspected one final time, backup plans were reviewed, and communication procedures were tested. Major Campbell gathered the team leaders for a final briefing on Saturday's timeline. Tomorrow is a rest day for most personnel, but we'll have essential staff maintaining equipment and handling final coordination with royal household staff and television crews. She continued, "Saturday morning, we begin positioning at 11 a.m. for the 3 p.m. service. That gives us time for final checks and adjustments, but it also means 4 hours of maintaining readiness. Mental preparation is as important as physical preparation." Captain Morrison raised a question that had been on many people's minds. What about family members who want to attend, but can't due to the restrictions? I know several of our team members have relatives who would have wanted to be there. Colonel Tonton en soir de toute folie. The Duke understood that duty sometimes requires personal sacrifice. The restrictions mean that many people who would have wanted to pay their respects in person will have to do so from a distance. But that makes our responsibility even greater. We're representing not just ourselves, but everyone who would have been there if circumstances were different. As evening approached, Hayes found himself walking the ceremony route one final time. The castle grounds were quiet, with only essential security personnel visible. In less than 48 hours, this same route would be the focus of worldwide attention. But tonight it belonged to his thoughts and reflections on the week's preparation. The week had been intensive, challenging, and ultimately rewarding in ways Hayes hadn't expected. Working with professionals from different service branches had reminded him why he had chosen a military career in the first place. The opportunity to be part of something larger than himself, to contribute to traditions that connected him to generations of service members who had faced similar challenges. But more than that, preparing for Prince Philip's funeral had deepened Hayes's understanding of what military service actually meant. It wasn't just about combat readiness or technical skills, though those were important. It was about dedication to standards that mattered regardless of who was watching, commitment to excellence that didn't depend on external recognition, and willingness to serve something greater than personal interest. Prince Philip had embodied these values throughout his life, and the ceremony they had prepared would demonstrate that these values lived on in the people he had supported and inspired. The precision they had achieved wasn't just about avoiding mistakes. It was about showing that some things were still worth doing perfectly, that honor and dignity still mattered in a world that sometimes seemed to have forgotten their importance. That night, as Hayes prepared for the rest day that would precede the ceremony, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to participate in something so meaningful. Saturday would bring pressure, emotion, and the weight of worldwide attention, but it would also bring the chance to honor a man who had dedicated his life to the values that made military service worthwhile. The team was ready. The preparation had been thorough, the rehearsals had been successful, and the dedication had been unwavering. Whatever challenges Saturday might bring, Hayes was confident that Prince Philip would receive the military tribute he had earned through 7 decades of service to his country and the military organizations he had supported. Tomorrow would be a day of rest and final mental preparation. Saturday would be the day when all their work would come together in a ceremony that would stand as a lasting tribute to a remarkable life of service. The Duke's final journey would be conducted with the precision, dignity, and military bearing that had characterized his own approach to duty throughout his long and distinguished life. Saturday morning dawned clear and still, as if the weather itself understood the solemnity of the day ahead. Hayes arrived at Windsor Castle at 5:30 a.m., 2 hours before his official start time, but found he was not alone in his early arrival. Throughout the castle grounds, members of the ceremonial team were already present, each dealing with a mixture of anticipation and responsibility in their own way. The atmosphere was different from the previous days of rehearsal. The practice and preparation were complete. Now, there was only the reality of performing when it mattered most. Hayes could see it in the faces of his colleagues, a quiet intensity that came from knowing that millions of people around the world would be watching, that history would record their actions, and that they had only one chance to get everything exactly right. Colonel Thornton was in the command center by 6 a.m., coordinating final communications with the royal household staff, television production crews, and security services. The complexity of managing all these different organizations while maintaining the integrity of the military ceremony had been one of the greatest challenges of the week, but her systematic approach had ensured that everyone understood their role and responsibilities. Weather conditions are perfect, she announced to the assembled team leaders. No wind, clear skies, optimal temperature. We couldn't have asked for better conditions for the ceremony. The bearer party had assembled in their preparation area by 6:30 a.m., beginning the careful process of putting on their ceremonial uniforms and conducting final equipment checks. Corporal Thompson moved among his team members, checking each detail of their appearance while maintaining the calm confidence that had characterized his leadership throughout the week. "Remember what we talked about yesterday," he said quietly to his team. "We're not just carrying a coffin today. We're carrying the final tribute of every service member who ever served under the Duke's patronage. That's an honor, but it's also a responsibility that requires our very best effort." Corporal Park, who had integrated into the team just days before, was demonstrating the focus and professionalism that had allowed him to seamlessly replace his flu-stricken colleague. The other team members had fully accepted him, and their unit cohesion was as strong as if they had been training together for months. The band of the Grenadier Guards was setting up their equipment with the precision of a military operation. Chief Warrant Officer Collins had arrived at 5 a.m. to conduct final acoustic tests and ensure that every instrument was properly tuned for the outdoor conditions they would face. The Duke specifically requested that the music reflect the dignity of military service rather than elaborate ceremonial fanfare. Collins reminded his musicians, "Every note we play today honors his memory and his approach to duty." Lieutenant Williams was conducting final checks on the modified Land Rover that would transport Prince Philip's coffin. The vehicle had performed flawlessly throughout the week of rehearsals, but the importance of the day demanded absolute certainty that every mechanical system was functioning perfectly. This vehicle represents the Duke's own practical approach to ceremonial duties, she explained to Hayes as he observed her methodical inspection. He could have chosen something more traditional, but he wanted something that reflected his military background and his preference for function over form. As the morning progressed, the team members took their positions with the quiet professionalism that had been evident throughout the week of preparation. But Hayes noticed something else in their demeanor, a sense of personal connection to the ceremony that went beyond their professional responsibilities. Flight Lieutenant Foster approached Hayes as she prepared the RAF standard for the ceremony. "Sergeant Major, I wanted to mention something. Yesterday, I received a message from my grandfather who served in the Royal Air Force during World War II. He remembered meeting the Duke at an air show in the 1960s. He said the Duke took time to talk with the enlisted personnel, asking about their experiences and showing genuine interest in their service." She paused, looking at the standard she would carry. "That's what I'll be thinking about today. Not just the technical requirements of carrying this flag, but the fact that it represents thousands of people who served with pride because they knew the Duke valued their contributions." Similar stories were emerging from other team members as the final preparations continued. Warrant Officer Roberts spoke about her father's service in the Royal Navy and how he had always spoken with respect about Prince Philip's understanding of naval traditions. Captain Morrison mentioned his regiment's long association with the Duke and the impact of his support on morale and unit pride. These personal connections were transforming the ceremony from a professional obligation into something deeply meaningful for everyone involved. They weren't just following protocols and executing rehearsed movements. They were participating in a final tribute to someone who had touched their lives and the lives of their families through his decades of service to the military. By 10:30 a.m., the first television crews and photographers were in position around the castle grounds. Hayes was struck by the contrast between the bustling technical activity of the media coverage and the calm, focused preparation of the military personnel. While cameras were being positioned and sound equipment was being tested, the ceremonial team continued their preparations with the same quiet professionalism they had shown all week. The arrival of the royal family at 2:30 p.m. marked the beginning of the final phase of preparation. Hayes could see the emotional weight of the day in their faces, but also their confidence in the military team that would be handling the ceremonial aspects of the service. Colonel Thornton's voice came through the communication system at 2:45 p.m. "All positions, this is command. We are 15 minutes from ceremony commencement. Final equipment checks and position confirmations." The responses came back crisp and professional from each team leader. The bearer party was in position, the band was ready, the vehicle crew was standing by, and the standard bearers were prepared for their roles. Hayes felt the familiar pre-operation tension that he had experienced countless times throughout his military career, but this was different. There was no enemy to face, no tactical objective to achieve in the traditional sense. Instead, there was the challenge of executing a perfect tribute to a man who had dedicated his life to the values they all served. At exactly 3 p.m., the ceremony began. Hayes watched from his coordination position as the modified Land Rover emerged from the state entrance, moving at the precisely controlled pace that Lieutenant Williams had practiced hundreds of times during the week. The vehicle looked both dignified and purposeful, exactly the balance that Prince Philip had envisioned when he helped design its modifications. The bearer party moved into position with the fluid precision that had been their goal throughout the week of preparation. 8 individuals functioning as one unit, their movements synchronized to a degree that appeared almost choreographed, yet maintaining the natural dignity that military bearing provided. The band of the Grenadier Guards began their musical accompaniment, and Hayes immediately recognized the acoustic balance that Chief Warrant Officer Collins had worked so hard to achieve. The music enhanced rather than dominated the ceremony, providing a soundtrack that honored both the solemnity of the occasion and the military character that Prince Philip had requested. As the procession moved along the route they had practiced so many times, Hayes was struck by how different it felt from the rehearsals. The presence of the royal family, the television coverage, and the knowledge that millions of people around the world were watching added a weight and significance that no amount of practice could fully replicate. But the team rose to the occasion exactly as Hayes had hoped they would. Every movement was controlled and precise, every timing mark was hit perfectly, and every detail reflected the weeks of careful preparation. More importantly, the ceremony had the character that Prince Philip had wanted: dignified, military in nature, but also personal and authentic rather than elaborately formal. The most challenging moment came as the procession reached St. George's Chapel and the bearer party executed the transfer of the coffin from the Land Rover. This was the movement that had required the most practice, the moment when the coordination between different elements of the ceremony was most critical. Hayes held his breath as Corporal Thompson led his team through the sequence they had rehearsed so many times. The transfer was executed with perfect precision, smooth, controlled, and dignified. The 8 Marines accepted the weight of Prince Philip's coffin as if they were accepting a sacred trust, which in many ways they were. The positioning of the military standards around the chapel during the service was equally flawless. Flight Lieutenant Foster and her colleagues moved with quiet professionalism, placing the flags in positions that honored both protocol requirements and the visual needs of the ceremony. Throughout the service, Hayes maintained communication with team leaders, but no adjustments or corrections were needed. The preparation had been so thorough, the rehearsals so comprehensive, that the ceremony unfolded exactly as planned. Every person knew their role, every timing was perfect, and every detail reflected the honor and respect that Prince Philip deserved. As the service concluded and the final notes of the last post echoed through the chapel, Hayes felt a deep sense of accomplishment and gratitude. The week of intensive preparation had culminated in a ceremony that perfectly honored Prince Philip's memory while demonstrating the continued excellence of the British military. But more than professional satisfaction, Hayes felt a personal connection to what they had achieved. Prince Philip had spent 7 decades supporting the military, advocating for service members, and demonstrating through his own example what dedication to duty looked like. The ceremony had been their opportunity to return that support, to show that the values he had championed were still alive in the people he had influenced. As the royal family departed and the media crews began to pack up their equipment, the military team began their own careful process of securing equipment and transitioning back to their regular duties. But Hayes knew that none of them would simply return to business as usual. They had participated in something significant, something that had connected them to the deepest traditions of military service. Colonel Thornton gathered the team leaders for a final briefing. What you accomplished today was exactly what Prince Philip would have expected from the British military, she said. Professional, dignified, and executed with the precision that comes from dedication to excellence rather than just following orders. She paused, looking around at the faces of people who had given their best effort for the past week. But more than that, you honored the memory of someone who understood that military service is about more than technical skills or following procedures. It's about commitment to values that matter regardless of circumstances, dedication to standards that don't change based on convenience, and willingness to serve something greater than personal interest. As Hayes prepared to leave Windsor Castle and return to his regular duties, he reflected on the unique experience of the past week. The intensive preparation, the pressure of worldwide attention, and the emotional weight of honoring Prince Philip's memory had created bonds among the team members that would last far beyond the ceremony itself. But more importantly, the experience had reinforced his understanding of why military service mattered. In a world that often seemed focused on immediate gratification and personal advancement, they had spent a week demonstrating that some things were still worth doing perfectly, that honor and dignity still had meaning, and that dedication to duty remained a value worth preserving. Prince Philip's final journey had been completed exactly as he had requested, with military honors that reflected both the traditions he had served and the practical, no-nonsense approach he had brought to everything he did. The ceremony would be remembered not just for its technical precision, but for its authentic representation of the values that had guided his life and the lives of the service members who had honored him. As Hayes drove away from Windsor Castle, he carried with him the satisfaction of a job well done and the deeper understanding that comes from participating in something truly meaningful. The Duke's final salute had been delivered with the respect, precision, and military bearing he deserved, ensuring that his legacy of service would continue to inspire future generations of military personnel who understood that duty, honor, and commitment to excellence were more than just words. They were principles worth dedicating your life to defending and preserving.